Sometimes heroes don't wear medals anymore. They wear silence. When a single dad working quietly as a maintenance man was asked his old Navy call sign as a joke, nobody expected the answer that froze an entire room. Because some names aren't just stories. They're legends, whispered by the sky itself. Before we begin, if stories of courage, kindness, and second chances speak to your heart, we'd be honored to have you join our channel. Subscribe, stay with us, and let these true-to-spirit tales remind you that quiet heroes still walk among us. Now, let's begin. SEAL Admiral asked a single dad veteran his call, sign as a joke, then Viper 1 made her freeze. The Navy cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime rhythm, metal trays clattering boots, striking tile laughter echoing off the steel-gray walls. The air smelled of coffee salt and a hint of jet fuel that never quite left any corner of the base. Ethan Cross sat near the end of the long hall, where sunlight from the high windows broke through the haze and spilled across his olive-green jumpsuit. His hands were calloused, the nails still carrying traces of engine grease. In front of him sat a simple lunch burger fries and a small carton of milk. Across the table, his daughter Katie swung her short legs, humming softly, her red hair glowing like a spark in the pale light. "Eat your greens, kiddo," Ethan said, with a tired smile pushing her tray closer. Katie frowned, poking at her broccoli. "Greens taste like grass, Daddy." "That's because they are grass, more or less," he said, chuckling. She giggled, and the sound cut through the cafeteria noise like sunlight breaking through cloud. To anyone watching, they looked ordinary, just a maintenance man and his little girl having lunch. And that was exactly how Ethan liked it. He had mastered the art of being unseen. But that piece was about to end. The double doors at the far end swung open, and in walked a group of SEAL officers in crisp uniforms, their chatter commanding instant attention. Among them was Admiral Fiona Drake, tall, confident with the kind of bearing that silenced rooms. Her white uniform gleamed under the fluorescent lights, metals glinting like frozen fire. "Ma'am, the maintenance crew's eating here too," one of the younger officers joked as they passed Ethan's table. His voice carried the sharp edge of arrogance that came from youth and power. Ethan didn't look up. He was used to that tone. Fiona glanced toward the sound. Her eyes briefly met Ethan's, and something flickered there, curiosity, maybe recognition. But before she could place it, one of her lieutenants smirked. "Hey, Chief," the lieutenant called out. "What rank are you?" "Mop Sergeant." Laughter rippled across the table. Even Fiona smiled faintly, the kind of reflex smile you give to keep the mood light. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't look angry, just steady, composed. He took a slow sip of coffee. Katie frowned, whispering, "Daddy, they're laughing at you." He reached over and patted her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart. Some people laugh because they don't know any better." The lieutenant wasn't done. He leaned forward on his elbows, voice louder now. "Come on, maintenance man, tell us what's your call sign. Every Navy guy's got one right." That earned another round of chuckles. Even Fiona, trying to play along, tilted her head with a teasing smile. "Yes, I'd like to know that too." She said, her tone playful, but edged with authority. "What's your call sign?" "Chief." The cafeteria went quiet. The workers at nearby tables turned, sensing tension under the laughter. Ethan finally looked up. His blue-gray eyes met hers, calm, distant, almost unreadable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but carried like a wind through the room, he said, "Viper 1." Silence dropped like a hammer. The laughter died mid-breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Somewhere, a tray hit the floor with a sharp metallic clang. Fiona froze. The name hit her like a ghost returning from the dead. Viper 1. 10 years ago, that call sign had belonged to a pilot who never came back from Operation Echo Dawn, a pilot who had saved her entire unit by drawing enemy fire away. She had written his eulogy herself. She had stood at the ceremony watching a flag folded over an empty coffin. And now that voice, that calm, grounded voice, had just spoken the name. She blinked, her composure cracking. I'm sorry. What did you say? Ethan didn't repeat himself. He just took another sip of coffee, eyes still on hers. Katie looked between them, confused by the sudden change in the room. Daddy, she whispered. One of the younger SEALs shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, did he just? Fiona raised a hand, silencing him. She studied the man in front of her, the broad shoulders beneath the worn green uniform, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, the small girl beside him with hair like wildfire. Her heart hammered in her chest. It couldn't be. But those eyes, she remembered them. She remembered the last radio transmission before the storm swallowed their planes. Bring them home. I'll hold the wing. Her throat tightened. Your name, she managed. What's your name, Chief? He stood slowly folding his napkin with deliberate calm. Ethan Cross, ma'am. For a moment, the cafeteria seemed to tilt. Fiona's knees nearly gave out. The name was carved into her memory, etched into the marble of the memorial wall she visited every year. Ethan Cross. Viper 1. Declared KIA, killed in action. But here he was alive, standing in front of her in a janitor's uniform, holding his daughter's hand. She stared, unable to speak. The lieutenant beside her cleared his throat awkwardly. Admiral. Should I stand down? Fiona said hoarsely. She looked around. The younger officers were all staring, unsure what had just happened. She forced a small, controlled smile. Lunch is over, gentlemen. Dismissed. They obeyed, instantly filing out without another word. When the room was quiet again, Fiona turned back. Ethan had already gathered his things. Katie looked up at her with innocent curiosity. Are you okay, ma'am? The girl asked sweetly. Fiona tried to smile. Yes, sweetheart. I just remembered something. Ethan's gaze softened. You always were good at remembering, Admiral Drake. The word struck her with gentle familiarity and finality. Before she could find her voice, he was already walking away. His daughter skipping beside him, her laughter echoing through the stunned silence of the hall. As the door closed behind them, Fiona stood motionless. Her hands trembled as memories came rushing back, the fire in the sky, the last signal, the impossible choice. She had signed the order that sent him on that mission. She whispered to no one. Viper 1, you were supposed to be gone. But somewhere deep down beneath the uniform, beneath the medals, a spark of something long buried flickered back to life. Guilt, wonder, and maybe hope. And for the first time in years, Admiral Fiona Drake didn't feel certain of anything. Sleep didn't come easy for Admiral Fiona Drake that night. The quarters reserved for flag officers were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of sterile silence that magnified every sound, every thought that refused to rest. The base outside had long gone still, but in her mind, the echoes of that cafeteria moment replayed again and again. Viper 1. She had heard those words once before over radio static and fire, when the sky itself had seemed to split apart. Now they had returned from the mouth of a man she'd buried in her memory and in official record alike. She got up from bed, tugged her uniform jacket tighter, and crossed the dimly lit corridor to her office. The sensor lights flickered to life as she entered, washing the room in pale fluorescent white. On the wall hung framed photographs, awards, missions crews. In the center was one from 10 years ago, the Echo Dawn unit, young faces smiling against the sunrise before deployment. Fiona's eyes lingered on the man standing slightly apart at the far left of the photo. tall, lean, with a quiet grin that didn't need to prove anything. Ethan Cross. She exhaled slowly. "You can't be alive," she whispered. But her heart knew otherwise. She powered up the old secure console that linked to the Navy's classified archives. After a moment, the blue seal of the Department of Defense glowed on the screen. Her access clearance gave her reach a few others. But even that felt like trespass tonight. Search Operation Echo Dawn. Personnel File Access Level Flag Officer Clearance, Fiona Drake. The system hummed, then presented the list of mission participants. Status column all accounted for. Except one. Cross Ethan J. Status KIA presumed. She opened the file. A black and white photo of Ethan appeared, dated 2015. Below it, the report she herself had signed: pilot lost in hostile airspace after diverting from flight path to cover evacuation convoy. Signal lost at 0431. No remains recovered. Declared deceased per protocol. Her name appeared at the bottom of the document, her signature firm and final. Fiona leaned back, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I signed your death," she murmured. The guilt she thought she'd long buried came clawing back with brutal clarity. She remembered that night, the radio gone dead, the command tower falling into chaos, her voice breaking when she had to report, "Viper 1 is down." And now, somehow, he was sitting in a cafeteria wiping tables and teaching a little girl how to eat her greens. She spent hours combing through mission debriefs, radar data, and recovery records. The more she read, the less sense it made. The crash site had never been confirmed, just open ocean storm debris and a signal that vanished like smoke. "How did you get out, Ethan?" she whispered into the glow of the screen. Her thoughts drifted to the moment he had said his name, not with pride, not with anger, just calm acceptance, as though the weight of the world had already been settled in him. She rubbed her hands together, the old ache of command heavy in her chest. She had spent years climbing rank after rank, earning medals, being saluted and obeyed. But what had it cost? Too many letters to too many families. Too many names carved into memorial walls. And one of them, Ethan's, had carved itself into her soul. Now he was alive, and she didn't know whether to feel relieved or ashamed. Near dawn, Fiona left her office. The first rays of morning bled through the horizon, tinting the base in shades of steel and rose. Out on the tarmac, aircraft lined up in perfect symmetry, their canopies catching the newborn light. She walked past hangar doors until she saw him, Ethan, his back turned, adjusting a panel on one of the older trainer jets. His movements were steady, methodical, the same precision she remembered from the cockpit days. Katie sat on a crate nearby, swinging her legs and drawing something on a piece of cardboard. She spotted Fiona and waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Admiral." Fiona managed a smile and nodded. "Good morning, Katie." Ethan turned at the sound of her voice. His eyes met hers again. No surprise there this time, only quiet recognition. "Admiral Drake," he said evenly. "You're up early." "So are you," she replied. "Maintenance starts before sunrise." He wiped his hands with a rag, shrugging. "Old habits. Planes don't wait for daylight." Her gaze dropped to the jet's side, faded paint scars from years of use. "That one's from the Echo series," she murmured. He nodded. "She's older than most folks here, but she still flies if you treat her right." There was something almost tender in the way he said it, and for a moment, Fiona saw not a janitor or mechanic, but the pilot who once trusted his life to the skies. "You shouldn't still be here," she said softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Here, as in this hangar, or here, as in breathing," she faltered. "Caught." "Both, maybe." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Yeah, that seems to surprise a lot of people." "Ethan." Her voice dropped. "The file says you were lost at sea. No retrieval, no beacon. What really happened?" He hesitated, looking past her toward the horizon. The sea kept its secrets. Maybe that's enough for now. The simplicity of it frustrated her, and yet disarmed her. She wanted to press for answers, but something in his tone, the quiet, unbreakable peace of a man who'd already fought every battle worth fighting, made her stop. "You read my file," he said suddenly. She blinked. "What makes you think that you've got that look, same one you had when you told me I wasn't ready for command flight school?" Eyes sharp, heart heavy. The memory hit her hard. Years ago, she had been his superior instructor before war turned them both into something else. "Why didn't you tell anyone you survived?" she asked quietly. He looked at Katie, who was humming to herself, drawing little airplanes in crayon. "Because I didn't want her to grow up watching the man who came back from war become a story again. I wanted her to have a father, not a legend." Fiona's throat tightened. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she wished to. "I thought I did the right thing," she whispered. "Back then." Approving the mission. He didn't answer right away. Then he said almost gently, "Sometimes we do what's right for the world and wrong for ourselves." For a long moment, neither spoke. The morning sun rose higher, bathing the hangar in gold. Finally, Fiona straightened. "If anyone deserves to be remembered for what he truly was, it's you. Not just a ghost." He smiled faintly. "Maybe ghosts are what keep the living honest." Katie looked up proudly, holding her cardboard sketch. "Look, I drew Daddy's plane." Fiona crouched beside her, smiling through the lump in her throat. "It's beautiful, Katie. Does your daddy still fly?" The little girl nodded. "Only in my dreams," she said innocently. "He says the sky remembers." Fiona's eyes stung. She stood watching as Ethan turned back to his work. Sunlight catching in his hair, like a flame rekindled. For the first time in years, Fiona Drake, Admiral Commander Survivor, felt something fragile stirring inside her. Not just guilt, not just relief. Something like grace. She looked one last time at the man the world believed dead and whispered under her breath, "Maybe the sky remembers. But so do I." By the third morning, whispers of Viper 1 had spread through the base like salt wind over steel decks. No one said it loudly, just in passing in the hangars in the break room. A mechanic might murmur, "Did you hear?" And another would reply, "Can't be true. He's just maintenance." But rumors have a way of outpacing truth, and the name carried an energy that neither rank nor rumor could suppress. Fiona Drake tried to ignore it. Admirals didn't chase gossip. They commanded fleets, wrote policy, signed orders. And yet, as she sat in her office overlooking the flight line, she found her mind drifting again and again to that quiet man and his little girl, the way he had said, Viper 1, without a flicker of pride or anger, as if the name no longer belonged to him. She shut her tablet and stood. "Enough," she muttered to herself. "If I'm going to understand this, I'll see it with my own eyes." Outside, the morning sun burned low over the horizon, turning the Pacific sky to molten gold. Fiona walked down the service corridor that led toward the maintenance hangars. She'd walked this path 1,000 times before, but never with her heart thudding quite like this. The hangar doors were half open, letting in slants of sunlight that caught motes of dust drifting like stars. Inside, the place was alive with quiet industry, the rhythmic clank of tools, the smell of oil and metal, the soft hum of conversation between crewmen. And there he was, Ethan Cross. He wore the same olive jumpsuit sleeves, rolled up forearms streaked with grease. He was kneeling beside a disassembled turbine engine, explaining something to a young mechanic who looked barely out of flight school. "See that?" Ethan said, pointing with a wrench. "You're reading the manual backward. This line isn't a fault, it's the design offset for cooling. If you fix what isn't broken, you'll break what keeps you safe." The young man frowned, then laughed in realization. "You're right. I've been chasing the wrong error all morning. Ethan smiled faintly. We all do that sometimes. Fiona stayed just outside the doorway watching. There was something hypnotic about the scene, the patience in his tone, the easy authority in his gestures. He didn't carry himself like a man trying to prove anything. He simply was. Katie sat nearby on a folded parachute, reading from a picture book about airplanes. Every now and then she'd look up and call Daddy story break, and Ethan would answer, "Give me 2 minutes, Ace." It was ordinary. And yet to Fiona, it was extraordinary. When the young mechanic left, Fiona finally stepped inside. "You make a habit of teaching my crew better than their own chiefs." Ethan didn't turn. "Only when they're about to melt a turbine worth $500,000. His tone wasn't disrespectful, just matter of fact. She found herself almost smiling. "You're not easy to ignore, Mr. Cross." He stood wiping his hands on a rag, and met her gaze. "Wasn't trying to be noticed, Admiral." "That's the problem," she said softly. "People like you never are." A silence hung between them, filled only by the distant drone of jets taking off. Fiona crossed her arms. "Tell me something. You could have gone anywhere after whatever happened out there. Why come back here?" He glanced toward Katie, who was now drawing on the hangar floor with a piece of chalk. "Because this is where I learned what it means to protect something bigger than yourself. And now I just keep things running. Machines, people, whatever needs fixing. You make it sound simple. It usually is. It's the living with it that gets complicated." Her throat tightened. He spoke like a man who'd already buried every version of himself that once dreamed. As the day wore on, Fiona stayed longer than she intended. She watched Ethan help an older engineer troubleshoot an auxiliary pump, then later volunteer to move crates the younger sailors avoided. He was tireless, uncomplaining, deliberate. When one of the base mechanics sliced his palm on a jagged panel, Ethan was there before the medic, grabbing a clean rag, applying pressure, steady calm. The others moved around him like gravity pulled them to his stillness. "Hold that tighter," he told the young man gently. "Bleeding's just the body's way of reminding you you're still alive. Don't waste it." Even Fiona felt something shift inside her as she watched respect mingled with guilt and an ache she couldn't name. She realized that despite all her medals and titles, there was something in this man's quiet dignity that outranked her in every way that mattered. Later that evening, when the hangar had emptied, she lingered near the doorway again. Ethan was closing up, checking every latch, every tool returned to its place. Katie had fallen asleep on a cot nearby, curled under his old flight jacket. "Does she know?" Fiona asked quietly. He looked over. "Know who her father really is?" Ethan smiled, soft and sad. "She knows who I was, but I'd rather she remember who I am now. The world already has enough ghosts wearing uniforms." Fiona stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved me that night." He looked down at the floor. "I saved who I could." She took a breath, feeling the weight of the years between them. "You should have been honored, Ethan. You should have been at Arlington, not scrubbing floors in Hangar 4. He met her gaze again, those calm, deep eyes that never flinched. "You think medals make peace? They just remind you what you lost to earn them." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but she couldn't. He was right. He turned toward his sleeping daughter, his expression softening. "You know, Admiral, sometimes I think the real heroes are the ones who survive long enough to learn kindness again." Fiona swallowed the lump in her throat. "You make it sound like a mission." "Maybe it is," he said. "One the Navy never trained us for." She nodded slowly, the truth settling deep in her chest. Outside, the last light faded over the runway. Somewhere in the distance, a lone aircraft's engines roared, slicing through the dusk. Fiona glanced up, following its climb until it vanished into cloud. When she looked back, Ethan was gently lifting Katie into his arms, her small head resting on his shoulder. The motion was effortless, protective, tender. He caught Fiona watching and said quietly, "We all keep flying somehow, Admiral. Just different skies." She stood there long after he'd left the hangar, the echo of his words lingering like the hum of a jet, long vanished. For the first time since the war, Fiona Drake felt something unshakable stir within her, a realization that maybe the greatest act of valor wasn't in commanding others, but in forgiving yourself. And as she turned to leave, she whispered to the empty hangar, "The quiet ones. They're the ones who save us all." The rain came hard that night. Sheets of water hammered against the glass of Admiral Fiona Drake's office, blurring the runway lights into trembling gold and crimson. The storm had rolled in from the sea, the kind sailors whispered about the kind that made you feel the ocean still ruled everything. Fiona sat at her desk, surrounded by silence and ghosts. A photograph lay open before her, a younger version of herself, standing beside a tall man in a flight suit, both laughing at something. Off camera, Ethan Cross, Viper 1. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced the edges of the picture. It had been taken 10 years ago, days before Operation Echo Dawn. She could still hear the radio chatter, the controlled chaos, and then that final voice through the static. "Bring them home. I'll hold the wing." It had been Ethan's last transmission. She had been the mission commander, the one who signed the deployment, who gave the green light. She'd lived with that decision for a decade, convincing herself it was duty. Now, with Ethan alive and mopping her hangar floors, duty felt like a sentence. Her aide, Commander Ruiz, knocked softly. "Ma'am, it's late. You should get some rest." Fiona looked up, her tone distant. "Do you remember Echo Dawn?" Ruiz hesitated. "The lost flight." "Of course, ma'am. Every academy student studies it as a case in tactical sacrifice." She gave a hollow smile. "That's one way to put it." Ruiz stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You knew him, didn't you?" "I approved his mission. I ordered him into the storm." Ruiz said nothing. There was nothing to say. He gave a slow nod, then quietly left, leaving Fiona alone again with the sound of rain and memory. Unable to sit still, she walked through the dim corridors toward the base archives. The night staff saluted as she passed, unsure why the Admiral was out at midnight in the middle of a downpour. Inside the archive room, the hum of old servers filled the air. Fiona keyed in her credentials and accessed the digital flight recordings. After a moment, the monitor flickered to life. Operation Echo Dawn Flight Audio Log, 4:16 hours. Through static, a younger version of her own voice crackled over the comms. "Viper 1, do you copy? Copy that command. Escort convoy in sight. You're flying into heavy weather, Viper. I see it. That's why I'm here." Then came the roar of wind, the scream of engines, and that last steady transmission. "Bring them home. I'll hold the wing." The screen went black. Fiona exhaled a sharp breath that trembled halfway out. She leaned back in her chair, whispering, "You didn't have to hold the wing for me, Ethan. You could have turned back." But she knew he never would have. That was who he was. That was what made him Viper 1. The next morning, she found herself standing outside Hangar 4 again, coffee in hand, pretending it was coincidence. Ethan was there, as always, quiet and methodical. Katie ran circles around him, her laughter echoing across the tarmac. Fiona hesitated before stepping forward. "You're early again," he smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard, and storms leave a mess." She gestured toward the coffee mug she carried. "I brought you one. Black, no sugar. You used to drink it that way." He looked at her, a flicker of something surprise memory crossing his face. "That was a long time ago, Admiral. I still remember." He accepted the cup, but didn't drink right away. "Why are you really here, Fiona?" Her name on his lips made her heartbeat stumble. "Because I found something." She handed him the old photo she'd kept since flight school. He took it, studying the two young pilots frozen in laughter. "We thought we'd live forever back then," he murmured. "Until I sent you to die." He glanced up sharply. "You didn't send me anywhere I wasn't willing to go. But I gave the order, because someone had to." She shook her head, voice breaking. "I should have been there with you." He set down the photo gently. "No, you were exactly where you were meant to be, bringing the others home. You did your job, Fiona." Her eyes filled. "And you lost everything because of it." Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring past her at the open sky. "I lost who I was," he said finally. "But I found who I needed to be." "What does that mean?" He nodded toward Katie, who was sitting cross-legged drawing something in chalk on the pavement. "That little girl out there. She's the reason I came back, the reason I stayed quiet." Fiona followed his gaze. Katie was sketching two airplanes side by side, one smaller, one larger, both surrounded by clouds shaped like wings. "She thinks you're a mechanic," Fiona said softly. "She thinks I fix things." Maybe she's not wrong. For a while they simply stood there in the hum of morning, two soldiers who had lived too long with silence. Then Fiona asked, "Do you ever miss it?" The sky then smiled a weary kind of smile. "Every day. But the sky doesn't miss me. That's how you know it's time to land." She looked at him, then really looked at him. The lines etched around his eyes, the quiet strength in his shoulders, the peace that had replaced the fire. "You know," she said softly, "you were supposed to be honored, Ethan. The Navy would have given you everything. A medal, a name in history." He took a sip of coffee, then said simply, "I didn't want history. I wanted peace. Heroes chase medals. Survivors chase sleep." Her throat tightened. "You deserve both." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "Fiona, the truth is none of us deserve peace. We build it one small kindness at a time. That's all." His words struck deeper than any speech she'd ever written. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for the mission, for believing you were gone, for not looking harder." He shook his head. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself forgiveness." The words hung in the air like a benediction. A gust of wind swept through the hangar, carrying the scent of rain and jet fuel. Fiona looked out across the airfield, the storm clouds parting to reveal a thin streak of blue sky. She turned back to him. "You always knew how to find light in a storm. Only because I've flown through worse." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Fiona said, "You were right yesterday. Maybe the real heroes are the ones who survive long enough to learn kindness again." Ethan gave a faint nod, eyes soft. "Then maybe it's time you stopped surviving and started living." The words caught her off guard. She almost replied, but then Katie came running, holding up her chalk drawing. "Look, Admiral," she said proudly. "That's Daddy's plane, and yours. I drew you both flying together." Fiona knelt beside her, smiling through tears she couldn't hide. "It's beautiful, Katie. You have a good heart." The child beamed. "Daddy says the sky remembers everyone who flies for love." Fiona looked up at Ethan. He smiled quietly, and for the first time in 10 years, she felt her heart lift. That night, as Fiona returned to her quarters, she placed the photograph back on her desk. But this time, she didn't see a mistake frozen in time. She saw a man who had chosen peace over glory, humility over bitterness. And for the first time in years, the great Admiral Drake whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for forgiveness. The base had quiet hours between drills, small pockets of stillness, where sunlight filtered through hangar glass, and the world felt almost gentle. On one of those afternoons, Fiona Drake found herself sitting alone in the cafeteria, again, the same place where everything had begun. Only this time there was no laughter, no taunting, no crowd of uniforms pretending not to stare. Just the sound of distant aircraft engines, the hum of an old ceiling fan, and the rhythmic tapping of a pencil between her fingers. She was reviewing mission proposals on her tablet, but not really reading them. Every name, every flight path, every authorization brought her back to Echo Dawn. Back to the man who should have been a ghost, and the child who called that ghost Daddy. She sighed, set the tablet aside, and glanced up. Across the room, she saw a flash of red hair. Katie Cross was sitting at a corner table, her legs too short for the chair, humming as she colored a picture of a plane. A half-finished chocolate milk sat beside her. The sight made Fiona smile despite herself. The little girl radiated something she hadn't seen in a long time, peace without permission. Fiona rose and walked over. "Mind if I sit here?" Katie looked up, eyes bright. "You're the lady from Daddy's work." "That's right." Fiona smiled, sitting down across from her. "I'm Admiral Drake." Katie nodded solemnly, as if being introduced to royalty. "Daddy says admirals are like captains, but with more coffee and less sleep." Fiona laughed a genuine laugh, the kind that startled even her. "He's not wrong." Katie grinned. "You laugh like my mom used to." The words slipped out so casually, but Fiona felt a lump rise in her throat. "Your mom?" "Uh-huh. Daddy says she's with the angels now, but she still checks on us when the sky's clear." Katie pointed out the window, where sunlight danced across the clouds. "He says that's her way of saying she's proud." Fiona swallowed hard. He sounds like a very wise man. "He is," Katie said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who believes her father can fix anything. "He used to fly airplanes too, but he doesn't anymore. He says the sky remembers him even if he doesn't remember it." Fiona blinked. "He told you that?" Katie nodded, still coloring. "Yep. He said the Navy used to call him something funny. Viper 1, but he told me not to say it loud." The pencil froze in Fiona's hand. Katie looked up, oblivious to the weight of her words. "He said it's just a name. What matters is what you do when no one's watching." For a moment, Fiona couldn't speak. It felt as though the air had thinned around her. Here was this small, freckled girl repeating truths her father had earned with blood and silence. She finally found her voice. "Katie, your dad's a very special man. I know the girl said simply blowing on her drawing. But don't tell him I said that. He doesn't like being called special. He says he's just lucky." Fiona smiled sadly. "He's more than lucky." Katie leaned forward, whispering as if sharing a secret. "When Daddy fixes things, he talks to them. Not out loud, but like, in his heart. He says everything broken just needs someone patient enough to believe it can still work." Fiona felt something inside her unravel a knot she'd carried for years. This child, too young to know loss in full, was teaching her about grace. "Your father's right," Fiona said softly. "That's what leaders do you know believe in what others think is broken." Katie beamed. "Then you must be really good at that too." Fiona's smile faltered. "I try. Daddy says trying counts more than medals." Fiona closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the cafeteria lights seemed warmer somehow. When Ethan arrived moments later, he froze at the doorway, half amused, half wary, to find his daughter and the Admiral deep in conversation. "Should I be worried?" he asked, lightly walking over. Katie waved. "Daddy, we were talking about medals and angels and broken things." Ethan shot Fiona a look, eyebrow raised. That sounds like trouble. Good trouble, Fiona said, smiling. She's quite the philosopher. She gets that from her mom, he said, sitting beside his daughter. I'm just the mechanic, Katie giggled. Mechanic of hearts. Ethan groaned, rubbing his forehead. See what happens when she eats too much sugar. Fiona chuckled. I think she's right. The three of them shared a quiet moment that felt startlingly natural, like a family that had somehow slipped out of time and into something simpler. Then Katie looked between them, her expression turning thoughtful. Daddy, were you and the Admiral friends before Ethan hesitated? A long time ago, sweetheart. Then why do you look sad when you talk to her? The question hit them both. Fiona looked down, her throat tightening. Ethan smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his daughter's forehead. Because grown-ups sometimes forget to say, thank you for things that really mattered. Fiona met his eyes. Or, sorry. Katie looked at them both, puzzled, but content. Well, you should say both. That's what Daddy taught me. Thank you and sorry. Fix almost everything. Ethan laughed quietly. She's not wrong. Fiona reached for her cup, trying to steady her emotions. Out of the mouths of children. Katie finished her drawing and slid it across the table. It showed 3 figures, one tall in green, one tall in white, and one small in red between them, all smiling under a big blue sky. This is us, she said proudly. I put us all together because the sky likes it that way. Ethan looked down at the picture, his voice barely above a whisper. You're something else, kiddo. Fiona stared at it too, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile warmth that didn't belong to rank or memory. Thank you, Katie, she said softly. I'll keep this. You promise, I promise. Katie grinned, packing her crayons. Okay, but you have to come see Daddy's workshop next time. He keeps a secret in there. Fiona arched an eyebrow. A secret? Katie nodded solemnly. It's small and metal and has wings. Ethan gave an amused sigh. You really can't keep anything to yourself, can you? Not when it's pretty, Katie replied, hugging him. Later, when Fiona walked back to her office, the child's drawing folded neatly in her jacket pocket. She felt lighter somehow. The guilt that had haunted her didn't vanish, but it had softened like a storm, finally breaking over calm water. She stopped at the memorial wall outside her building, the one engraved with names lost in service. Her fingers brushed across the cold metal, where Ethan J. Cross was still carved. Maybe she whispered, it's time to start believing broken things can still fly. Behind her, through the glass, sunlight spilled across the base. The storm had passed. And somewhere nearby, a little girl's laughter echoed clear as wind through wings. It began with the sirens. The shrill, slicing cry of the emergency alarm split the quiet afternoon, echoing across the entire naval base. Officers spilled from offices, boots, pounding concrete orders, flying through the air like tracer rounds. The calm rhythm of maintenance and drills dissolved into chaos within seconds. Admiral Fiona Drake was in the middle of a briefing when her comm unit buzzed urgent tone red code. She snatched it from her belt. Admiral, this is Control Tower Delta training vessel. Hawthorne just reported mechanical failure midair. They're losing altitude fast. 2 SEAL instructors and 3 cadets on board. Her blood ran cold. Get me visual and patch through to flight operations. Now! She strode from the conference room, her boots clicking sharp and fast. Around her, personnel cleared the hallway. Within seconds, she was in the command center screens, glowing voices overlapping. Telemetry is unstable. Fuel system. Failure confirmed, engine 2 offline. They're over Sector Echo 5, Admiral. Altitude dropping below 4,000 feet. Fiona scanned the display, jaw tightening. The Hawthorne was an aging trainer jet, same model Ethan had been restoring the week before. A hollow dread filled her stomach. "Who's on the flight crew?" she demanded. "Lieutenant Brooks and Commander Hale, ma'am." She knew both. Kids practically smart, eager, the kind who still believed the sky was invincible. "Attempt remote override on their stabilizer," she ordered, "and launch rescue choppers to intercept." "Yes, ma'am." Then a voice spoke from behind her, calm but unyielding. "You won't make it in time." She turned. Ethan Cross stood in the doorway, still wearing his green maintenance suit, a wrench hooked on his belt, and that same quiet steadiness in his eyes. "Mr. Cross," she began. "This is a restricted operation. You're not cleared, ma'am. That trainer's hydraulic system is patched from last year's recall. The control rods shear under stress above 3,500 feet. If they're at that altitude now, they've got maybe 3 minutes before total system lock." The room went silent. Technicians glanced between the two of them. Fiona took a step closer. "How do you know that?" "Because I built the override system that kept those birds in the air, and because that's the same model I went down in." The words hit her like a punch. "Ethan," he held up a hand, calm but resolute. "You've got rescue birds warming up on the tarmac. Good. Keep them there. But if you send them in now, they'll arrive to pick up wreckage. Let me go." Her pulse hammered. "You are not active personnel. You can't just take a jet and—" "Then don't call it a mission," he said quietly. "Call it a father doing what he was trained to do, keep kids alive." The control room waited, every pair of eyes flicking to her. "Ma'am," one officer said hesitantly, "we don't have a pilot on standby with his flight credentials." "Credentials," Ethan cut in. "I don't need a piece of paper to remember how to fly." For a moment, Fiona could only stare at him. He was the same man she had believed dead, the same man who had saved her years ago. Now that same fire buried under humility and loss was blazing again. She lowered her voice. "If you do this, they'll court-martial you. They'll court-martial me." He looked at her with calm conviction. "Then I guess we'll both finally be on the same side of the sky." Her breath caught. For a fleeting second, she saw it again, the pilot she had once trained beside the man who flew like he could outthink gravity itself. "Control," she said hoarsely. "Prep the trainer in Hangar 4. Now." The room exploded into motion. Minutes later, rain began to fall as the hangar roared alive. Mechanics sprinted across the floor, technicians shouting readings. Fiona stood beside the jet headset in hand, while Ethan climbed into the cockpit movements, fluid and certain as though the years had never passed. Katie stood at the hangar door, clutching a blanket, eyes wide. "Daddy." He turned, crouched down for a moment, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You stay with the Admiral, okay? She's the boss now." Katie frowned. "But you're my hero." He smiled softly. "Heroes fix things. Remember, Daddy's just going to fix something big." Fiona's throat tightened. "We'll bring him back, Katie, I promise." The girl nodded, tears glinting in her eyes as she whispered, "Keep the wing." "Daddy." Ethan climbed into the cockpit. The canopy sealed shut with a hiss. Engines spooled up, vibrating the hangar floor. Fiona stepped closer to the intercom. "Tower. This is Admiral Drake. Authorization code Bravo 47. Release clearance for temporary flight recon manual override." There was a pause. "Confirmed, Admiral. You're assuming full accountability." She looked at Ethan through the glass. "I am. Roger that. Runway's yours." The hangar doors opened to reveal a sky streaked with stormlight. The jet's engines roared, and for one breathtaking moment, Fiona saw Viper 1 reborn, the ghost of the man who'd once vanished into fire, now tearing through the rain alive again. Inside the command center, officers tracked the signal. Fiona stood at the console headset pressed tight. "Control, this is Viper 1. I've got eyes on the Hawthorne. She's venting fuel tail section unstable. They're spinning? Copy that, Viper 1. You're below safe altitude. Wouldn't be the first time. Static crackled, then his calm voice again. Tell those kids to cut auxiliary power and lock their flaps halfway. I'll line up under them. Ethan. You can't, Fiona started, but he interrupted. You said we build peace one kindness at a time. This is mine. On the radar, 2 dots moved closer, one climbing, one descending. Fiona gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, seconds stretched into eternity. Then contact. The dots aligned. Viper 1 to Hawthorne, hold steady. You're not falling alone. The command center was silent except for the hum of machinery and the faint sound of breathing over the radio. And then through the static, we've got lift, leveling out. Cheers erupted across the room, but Fiona didn't move. She could only listen as Ethan's voice came again, soft and steady. Control confirm, all personnel safe. Confirmed, she whispered. Good. A pause, then Viper 1 returning to base. The sky still remembers us. Fiona closed her eyes as the radio filled with applause and tears. 20 minutes later, the jet's wheels touched down, skidding slightly before coming to rest. When the canopy lifted, Ethan climbed out, drenched in sweat and rain. Fiona ran toward him, every ounce of protocol forgotten. He smiled faintly. Told you it could still fly. She didn't answer. She just threw her arms around him. Welcome back, Viper 1. For a moment, the world seemed to stop the storm, the noise, the years between them. And above them, the rain began to ease, the clouds parting just enough for a thin band of sunlight to break through like a salute from the sky itself. The next morning broke with a brilliance that only follows storms. The Pacific shimmered like glass, and the naval base buzzed with energy. It wasn't official yet, but the story was everywhere, passed from mechanic to marine, from sailor to SEAL. The janitor saved the crew. The ghost pilot returned. Viper 1 flew again. For the first time in years, the base was alive with a different kind of electricity. Not fear, not formality, but awe. Fiona Drake watched from her office window, hands clasped behind her back, eyes following the morning drills. She'd barely slept, but she didn't feel tired. The adrenaline from the rescue still hummed beneath her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear that calm, steady voice through the radio. This is Viper 1. The sky still remembers us. Those words hadn't just saved 5 lives. They'd resurrected something inside her, a faith she hadn't even realized she'd buried. The door opened softly behind her. Commander Ruiz stepped in holding a stack of printed reports. His expression was careful. Admiral. He began. The investigation board wants a full account of yesterday's incident. They're calling it an unauthorized intervention. She turned, arching an eyebrow. Unauthorized. Technically, ma'am, Mr. Cross isn't enlisted personnel. Fiona gave a dry laugh. He wasn't unauthorized when he saved 5 officers. Was he? Ruiz hesitated. No, ma'am. But command doesn't like ghosts reappearing on flight logs. They're already asking questions. Let them ask me. He nodded, lowering his voice. You might face a formal review. Then I'll face it, she said simply. And if they ask who gave the order, tell them the truth, I did. Ruiz gave a slow, admiring nod. Yes, ma'am. When he left, Fiona turned back toward the window, her reflection caught in the glass, half light, half shadow. Somewhere out there, Ethan Cross was walking among living men again, and every regulation in the Navy couldn't undo that. She found him later that afternoon near the far end of the runway, working on the battered trainer jet he'd flown back. It sat gleaming in the sunlight, scarred but whole like its pilot. Ethan was tightening a bolt on the fuselage when she approached. His sleeves were rolled up, and the wind ruffled his hair, as if the air itself knew who he was. Shouldn't you be resting? She asked. He looked up with a faint grin. Resting. Never fixed a machine. Neither does guilt. That made him pause. He turned the wrench one last time, then set it down. I'm not guilty, Admiral. Just grounded. She stepped closer, her voice softening. You scared the hell out of me. You and me, both. You could have died out there. He met her gaze evenly. I already did remember the words cut through her composure. For a long moment, they simply stood in the sunlight, silence filled with all the things they hadn't said for a decade. Finally, Fiona broke it. Do you realize what that flight did for this base? For those kids? For me, he smiled faintly, eyes glinting. Didn't do it for any of you. Did it because the sky was calling. And maybe, he looked toward the horizon. Maybe I wanted to see if it still remembered my name. She studied him, the wind catching the edges of her uniform jacket. It does, Ethan. It never forgot. At the other end of the runway, Katie appeared running toward them, her small backpack bouncing with every step. She carried a handmade cardboard model of a plane, complete with drawn-on call signs. "Daddy," she called out, waving. "They said you were on the news." He crouched to catch her as she reached him, sweeping her into a hug. "News, huh? Hope they got my good side." Fiona knelt beside them, smiling. "You must be very proud of your father." Katie nodded, eyes shining. "He saved people just like the stories he tells me. But Daddy says it wasn't saving. It was just remembering how to care fast enough." Fiona's throat tightened again. That sounds like something only a real pilot would say. "Daddy's not a pilot," Katie said innocently. "He's a fixer." Ethan laughed softly, setting her down. "That's right, kiddo. Always a fixer." Fiona looked at him, her voice quiet but filled with admiration. "You didn't just fix that plane yesterday. You fixed a piece of this base. You reminded everyone what courage looks like when it isn't wearing medals." He shook his head. "Courage is easy when someone else's life depends on it. It's living afterward that takes work." She nodded slowly. "You sound like someone who's finally made peace with his ghosts." He looked down at his daughter and smiled, maybe because one of them decided to draw wings on cardboard instead of tombstones. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Pacific, Fiona and Ethan stood on the pier, watching the horizon burn in shades of amber and violet. The day had been long, debriefings, reports, endless forms. But here, in the golden quiet, none of it mattered. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The sky," he smiled faintly. "Every day. But sometimes it's enough just to know it misses you back." She laughed softly. "That's not how the sky works." He looked at her eyes steady. "Sure it is. You fly long enough, it learns your name. And when you're gone, it keeps whispering it to the clouds." Fiona looked away, blinking against the sting of emotion. "You always did know how to make the impossible sound poetic. Or maybe you just stopped believing it was possible." They stood in silence for a while, the waves lapping against the pier. Then she said almost to herself, "When you said, 'The sky still remembers us,' over the comms, I think half the base forgot how to breathe." "Funny," he murmured. "I was just trying not to crash." She smiled, shaking her head. "You're impossible, Ethan Cross." He looked at her, then really looked, and said softly, "No, Admiral. Just alive. That's miracle enough." The words lingered between them, simple but profound. She realized in that moment that maybe miracles didn't arrive in blinding light or grand gestures. Maybe they came in the quiet return of someone the world had already mourned. Later that night, as Fiona walked back to her quarters, she passed a group of young recruits talking near the gate. One of them was saying, voice full of awe, "Did you hear him on the radio? The way he said it. Viper 1, the sky still remembers us. Gives you chills." She paused unseen in the shadows, listening to them. There was something healing in the way they spoke, not like soldiers, but like believers. Inside her office, she found Katie's cardboard model sitting on her desk, left there by small hands. Across the tail, written in uneven crayon, were 3 words: "Keep the wing." Fiona traced the letters, gently, tears pricking her eyes. The base lights outside flickered against the glass, reflecting her face, and faintly the ghost of a man she'd once thought lost. Somewhere out on the runway, she knew Ethan Cross was looking at the same sky. No medals, no ranks, just a man who had come home to where he belonged. And as the stars began to emerge, faint but sure, she whispered into the quiet, "The sky remembers you, Viper One, and so will I." By dawn the next day, peace had already started to fracture. The morning brief at headquarters was no longer a routine exchange of weather updates and drill schedules. Now every corridor buzzed with a tension that hummed beneath polite salutes and clipped voices. Fiona Drake could feel it long before she stepped into the operations hall, the way officers avoided eye contact, the way whispers died the moment she entered. When she reached her desk, her aide, Commander Ruiz, was waiting file in hand. "Admiral," he said quietly. "The Defense Oversight Board called. They're requesting a full incident report from yesterday's flight. They've already sent investigators from the Pentagon." Fiona's jaw tightened. That was fast. Ruiz hesitated. Someone leaked the flight logs. The call sign Viper One is trending on military channels. They're calling him a ghost pilot, the dead man who stole a Navy jet. She felt her pulse quicken. "Stole," she repeated sharply. "Technically, ma'am. He wasn't authorized to fly it." Fiona closed her eyes for a moment. She could still see the scene: Ethan climbing into the cockpit rain, hammering the hangar roof, his voice steady as he said, "Let's bring them home." It hadn't felt like a crime then. It had felt like redemption. She straightened. "Set up a briefing in conference room 2. "I'll handle this." 2 hours later, the glass-walled conference room filled with the low murmur of officers and visiting officials. Across the table sat 3 men in dark suits, from Washington faces, carved from the same stone of bureaucracy. The eldest, a gray-haired colonel named Winters, began without preamble. "Admiral Drake, we appreciate your cooperation. You're aware we're investigating an unauthorized flight that took place yesterday under your command, I am, and that this flight was executed by a civilian employee, formerly Lieutenant Ethan Cross, declared KIA in Operation Echo Dawn." "Yes," Winters leaned forward. "Then let's start with the obvious question. Why was a deceased pilot flying one of our jets?" Fiona met his gaze steadily. "Because no one else could have saved those cadets." A murmur rippled through the room. Winters frowned. "You're admitting you allowed this man to commandeer government property? I authorized it," she said firmly. "Under my command authority." Another official, a younger man with sharp glasses, interjected. "You understand that's a direct violation of protocol." "Yes," Fiona replied, "but I also understand that those 5 officers would be dead if I hadn't." For a moment, silence. Winters studied her carefully. "You were his commanding officer during Echo Dawn, correct?" "I was." "Then you also signed his death declaration." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Yes. And now you're telling us that man has been alive for a decade, working on your base, under an assumed role, without clearance, without identity, verification." Fiona's voice softened, but it didn't waver. He wasn't hiding. He was surviving. Winters' tone sharpened. "Admiral, this is not a story about survival. This is a breach of federal protocol. A dead man reappears and steals a fighter jet. You must understand how that looks on paper." Fiona leaned forward. "Then let me tell you how it looks off paper." Her voice carried through the room like a command bell. "It looks like a man who gave everything for his country. His name, his life, his peace coming back to save our own when no one else could. It looks like the kind of courage the Navy used to stand for." The younger official shifted uncomfortably. Winters stared at her for a long moment, then closed the file. "We'll be reviewing your statement. You'll receive formal notice of disciplinary proceedings within 72 hours. I understand. As they gathered their papers, one of them muttered almost under his breath, "We can't have ghosts flying our jets." Fiona's reply was quiet, but it stopped them in their tracks. Maybe that's exactly who should be flying them, people who've already learned what dying costs. That evening, the base felt heavier than usual. Fiona found Ethan in his workshop, the lights dim, the rhythmic click of tools echoing softly. Katie was asleep on a cot nearby, clutching her father's old flight patch. He looked up as Fiona entered. "Let me guess," he said. "The suits came calling." They did. "And I'm the villain of the week." She managed a weary smile. "Only because they don't know you." He set down his wrench. "Doesn't matter. They'll pull my clearance, maybe press charges. You know how this works. I told them it was my decision." He froze. "You and I took full responsibility," she said simply. "You didn't break protocol, I did." Ethan stood, disbelief flashing across his face. "Fiona, you just put your career on the line." "For me." She met his gaze, calm but unwavering. "For the truth." He shook his head, almost laughing. "You don't owe me that." "Yes, I do." Her voice softened. "For 10 years I've been living like I was still in that storm, trying to justify every order, every loss. You were the one name I couldn't forgive myself for. Yesterday, you gave me the chance." Ethan turned away, running a hand through his hair. "And you think they'll see it that way?" "They don't have to," she said. "But I do." The silence between them was thick with unspoken history. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low. "You shouldn't have to pay for my past, and you shouldn't have to hide from it." He looked at her, then the steel in her posture, the fire in her eyes. The Admiral he remembered had always commanded storms. Now she stood against one for him. "I used to think courage was just flying into danger," he said quietly. "Turns out it's standing still and telling the truth." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll stand together." Later that night, Fiona stood outside on the tarmac. The air was cool, stars faint above the glow of the base lights. Beside her, Ethan watched the runway, the same strip of asphalt where his legend had ended and his redemption begun. "What happens now?" he asked. "Maybe they take our uniforms. Maybe they don't. But they can't take what yesterday meant." He nodded slowly. "You ever wonder if the sky keeps score?" She looked up, following his gaze. "No, the sky doesn't judge. It remembers." Ethan smiled, his voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe that's enough." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of salt and jet fuel. Fiona closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the strange calm that comes after choosing truth, no matter the cost. When she opened them again, Ethan was looking at her, not as a subordinate or a ghost, but as a man finally seen. And for the first time in years, she didn't see loss when she looked at him. She saw a beginning. The ceremony was small, quiet, and hidden from headlines, just how Ethan preferred it. The hangar doors were rolled halfway open, letting in a wash of golden light from the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of oiled jet fuel and salt, the familiar perfume of the life he'd once lived and thought he'd left behind. A few dozen officers stood in dress uniforms, backs, straight faces solemn. On a small platform at the center, Admiral Fiona Drake stood behind a wooden podium, her uniform crisp, her expression calm but distant. In her hands was a single velvet case. Inside it gleamed a medal, a Navy Cross reissued to replace the one that had been awarded posthumously a decade ago. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When she looked up, her gaze met Ethan's across the hangar. He was out of uniform, dressed in simple civilian clothes, olive green shirt sleeves, rolled hands tucked in his pockets. He didn't belong among the ranks anymore, and he didn't try to pretend he did. Katie stood beside him, holding his hand, her hair catching the sunlight like copper fire. Fiona's voice carried steady and clear. 10 years ago, Lieutenant Ethan Cross was declared missing in action during Operation Echo Dawn. His final transmission, "Bring them home. I'll hold the wing," became a phrase etched in naval history, a symbol of sacrifice. Yesterday, that same voice returned, not from legend, but from life. She paused, eyes flickering toward him. Some would call what he did reckless. Others would call it impossible. I call it proof that courage doesn't expire with a uniform. A quiet murmur swept through the crowd. Fiona continued, her tone softening. Today, the Department of Defense restores his service record and his rank in recognition of valor beyond measure. But more than that, it restores the truth. Because heroes don't disappear when the paperwork says they do. They endure. She closed the case and stepped forward. For a moment, the room held its breath as she approached him. "Ethan Cross," she said quietly, handing him the medal for what you gave, for what you carried, and for what you taught us. Thank you. He looked down at it, the medal gleaming in his palm. Then he shook his head with a faint smile. "I appreciate it, Admiral. But maybe you should keep it. You were the one who remembered." Fiona's throat tightened. "This isn't for remembering Ethan. It's for coming home." He closed her fingers gently around the medal. Home isn't always a place you come back to. Sometimes it's a person you forgive. She froze at the weight of those words, the truth of them settling in her chest like a stone and a bomb all at once. Then, without another word, he saluted her, a crisp, perfect gesture that drew a shimmer of tears to more than one pair of eyes in the room. Fiona returned it, her hand trembling slightly. After the ceremony, the crowd thinned quickly. Officers shook Ethan's hand, some clapping him on the shoulder, others too stunned to find words. But when the last of them left, the hangar fell quiet again. Fiona lingered near the podium, watching as Ethan lifted Katie onto a workbench. She swung her legs, humming as she examined the medal still clutched in Fiona's hand. "Is that shiny thing Daddy's?" she asked. Fiona smiled softly. "It is. But I think he wants me to keep it." Katie tilted her head. "Why, maybe because some things aren't meant to be worn. They're meant to be remembered." Katie nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Like Mommy." Fiona blinked, caught off guard. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly like Mommy." Ethan turned toward them, his expression warm but weary. "You always had a way with words, Admiral." She smiled faintly. "You always had a way of making them matter." He walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. "They're offering me reinstatement," he said quietly. "Honorary commission, advisor role, maybe even training command. That's good news." He nodded. "It is." But I said no. The words landed like a gust of wind through the hangar. Fiona frowned. "Why, because it's time to stop flying borrowed skies," he said simply. "Katie deserves routes, not runways." She swallowed. "You're leaving then?" "Yeah," he exhaled. "I found a place up north. Small town near the coast. I'll take some work at the airfield there. Maybe fix old planes for fun. She'll have a school with real trees instead of hangars." Fiona's lips curved into a sad smile. "Sounds peaceful. That's the plan." He hesitated. Eat is softening. "You should come visit sometime. Katie could use another person who believes in the sky." Fiona laughed quietly, blinking away tears she didn't want him to see. "You always know how to make goodbyes sound easy," he shrugged. "I've had practice." A long silence hung between them. Sunlight poured through the open hangar doors, outlining them both in gold. Then Katie slid off the workbench and tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can we go see the water before we leave?" "Sure thing, kiddo." He turned to Fiona, holding her gaze. "Thank you. For yesterday. for everything. She wanted to tell him everything she'd kept locked inside: the regret, the admiration, the impossible tenderness she couldn't name. But all she managed was keep the wing, Ethan. His smile deepened. Always. They walked together down to the pier, Katie skipping between them, clutching both their hands. The ocean was calm, mirroring the burnished orange of the evening sky. Seagulls wheeled above, crying faintly against the wind. When they reached the end of the pier, Fiona stopped. "This is where we say goodbye." Ethan nodded. "For now." Katie released their hands and knelt by the edge, tossing pebbles into the water. "Look, she said they make ripples like wings," Ethan chuckled. "She sees everything in flight terms. Must be genetic." Fiona smiled, her heart aching in the sweetest way. "Then you've done something right." He looked at her one last time, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the Admiral and the ghost, bound by 10 years of silence and 1 day of grace. "Take care of her," Fiona said softly. "Always," he replied. He turned to go, Katie running ahead, her laughter scattering across the pier like wind chimes. Fiona watched them until they were only silhouettes against the fading light. Then slowly, she opened her hand. The Navy Cross glimmered in her palm. Ethan's medal, her burden, their shared truth. She whispered to the wind, "Some medals belong to the living, some to the forgiven." The waves rolled in gentle applause. The harbor was still half asleep when Fiona Drake arrived. A gray mist clung to the water, softening the edges of ships and cranes, and the world seemed to breathe slower, as if the day itself didn't yet want to wake. She stood by the pier coat collar turned up against the wind eyes fixed on the small civilian ferry moored at the dock. Ethan Cross stood at the end of the gangway, one duffel slung over his shoulder, Katie's small hand clasped in his. The little girl wore a red sweater far too big for her sleeves covering her hands as she waved goodbye to the sailors who had come to see them off. Fiona took a breath that tasted like salt and silence. She'd promised herself she would be calm. Admirals were supposed to be composed after all. But as she watched the man who'd once been Viper 1 preparing to vanish again, her chest tightened with something she couldn't command away. "Morning," Admiral Ethan said when he saw her. His smile was faint but genuine. "Didn't expect you'd come see us off." "I owed you that much," she said. "Besides, I wanted to make sure you didn't steal another government vehicle on the way out," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Tempting. But I think I've used up my 9 lives." Katie let go of his hand and ran to Fiona, her steps quick and bright. "Admiral, look what Daddy made me." In her hands was a small metal badge shaped like wings, worn smooth at the edges with a single engraving. Fiona knelt to eye level. "That's beautiful, Katie. What does it mean Daddy said it's his lucky wing? He told me whoever carries it will always find their way home." Fiona's throat caught. She turned to Ethan. "That's the one you kept from flight school, isn't it?" He nodded. "Only thing that survived the crash. And you're giving it to her." He looked down at his daughter, then back at Fiona. "She's the best pilot I've ever known. Already navigated me through more storms than any radar." Katie giggled and slipped the badge into Fiona's hand. "Daddy said you should hold it until we come back, so you don't forget us." Fiona blinked, her vision blurring for a moment. She closed her fingers around the small piece of metal, feeling the cool weight of memory. "I couldn't forget either of you if I tried." Ethan watched her eyes soft. She wanted to be the one to say goodbye. "I told her goodbyes are just different ways of saying thank you." "Then I guess—" "Thank you," Fiona said quietly. "For coming back, for proving some ghosts still choose light." He smiled, the kind of smile that said everything words couldn't. The ferry horn sounded low, mournful final. Crew members began to pull up the gangway. Katie hugged Fiona fiercely, her small arms trembling. "Will you visit?" she whispered. "I promise," Fiona said, her voice thick. "And when you look at the sky, remember someone up there is watching you with pride." Katie nodded solemnly, as if memorizing the words. Then she ran back to her father, who lifted her into his arms. For a moment, Fiona and Ethan simply looked at each other, across the distance, 1,000 unsaid things suspended in the salt air. "You could still stay," she said, suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. He shook his head gently. "I already have, Admiral. I stayed long enough to find peace. Now it's your turn." She wanted to protest, but he was right. They had both lived too long under the weight of what had been lost. The ferry engines rumbled to life. The deckhands called final orders. Ethan stepped aboard, Katie waving wildly as the vessel began to drift from the dock. Fiona followed along the pier until the gap between them widened, until her voice could no longer reach. Then, just as the ferry turned toward open sea, a sound crackled from the small radio clipped to her coat, the same frequency she hadn't touched since Echo Dawn. "This is Viper 1, the voice said, steady, familiar, achingly alive. "Signing off, but never gone." Fiona froze, staring at the device, heart stuttering. She looked up, and there it was above the harbor, cutting through the morning mist. A single gull wheeled in the pale sky, its wings catching the first blush of sunrise. She could almost imagine it tracing the same path Ethan once flew, a reminder that even endings could carry flight. She pressed the badge in her palm to her chest and whispered, "Fair winds, Viper 1. Hours later, the base had returned to its routine rhythm. Meetings, orders, schedules. The world moved on, but something in Fiona's heart had changed. She walked through the corridors no longer as the Admiral burdened by ghosts, but as a woman who had finally let one rest. That evening, she opened her office window to the setting sun. On her desk sat the small badge with the engraving V1 glinting softly beside a folded photo. 3 figures, one in olive green, one in white, and a little girl in red. She traced their outlines with her fingertip and smiled. For the first time in years, she felt free of the endless hum of duty, of loss, of questions without answers. Ethan had been right. Some skies didn't need wings to remember you. She lifted her glass toward the horizon, where the faint contrail of a plane streaked across the dusk. "To those who hold the wing," she murmured. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the sea and the faint echo of a child's laughter. Far from the base aboard the small ferry cutting through calm waters, Ethan stood at the railing, watching the coastline fade. Katie slept, curled against his side, her head resting on his arm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of paper, a handwritten note Fiona had slipped into his hand before he boarded. On it were 3 words, "Keep the wing." He smiled to himself, folding it carefully and tucking it next to his heart. As the first stars appeared, he tilted his head back to the sky and whispered, "You heard her, old friend. We're keeping it." The horizon glowed faintly the color of new beginnings. The sky had not forgotten him, nor he it. And somewhere between the fading shore and the endless open water, Viper 1 finally found his peace. A year passed. Time, Fiona Drake had learned, doesn't heal all wounds. It just teaches you how to walk with them. She had left the Navy 6 months after Ethan's departure. The resignation had shocked half the Pentagon, one of the youngest admirals in SEAL history stepping down in her prime. But for her, the decision hadn't felt like loss. It had felt like exhaling after years of holding her breath. Now the base that had once echoed with her commands belonged to someone else. And Fiona had found a new mission, one that didn't require medals, briefings, or protocol. She stood in front of a modest hangar painted white, the words, "Wings of Tomorrow Flight Academy" arched above the doors. Inside, the laughter of children filled the air, high, bright, unburdened. "Ma'am, they're ready," a young instructor called. Fiona smiled. "Then let's begin." The academy sat on a stretch of reclaimed airfield outside San Diego. What had once been an abandoned training strip was now alive again, with small aircraft, hopeful eyes, and a purpose that mattered more than orders ever had. Today was opening day, the first class of orphans and children of veterans beginning flight training. Fiona walked among them, correcting postures, teaching them how to steady their breathing before touching the controls. Her voice was softer now, less command, and more compassion. "Flying isn't about escaping the ground," she told them. "It's about trusting you'll find your way back." As the children took turns in the simulator, Fiona stepped outside to the field. A cool wind swept through, carrying the scent of jet fuel and new beginnings. She looked toward the sky eyes, tracing the faint outlines of cloud trails. It had been a year, but she could still hear his voice, steady, unhurried, the voice that once guided her through fire. "The sky still remembers us." She smiled faintly. "Yes, Ethan," she whispered. "It does." By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in gold and amber. The children gathered by the edge of the runway for the day's final exercise, writing messages on small paper planes. Fiona read one from a boy with wide brown eyes. "For my dad in heaven, fly safe." Another said, "For my mom, thank you for teaching me to be brave." She tucked them all into her pocket, heart full. "You'll all make fine pilots someday," she told them. "Will you fly too, Miss Fiona?" a little girl asked. She hesitated. Maybe one day. But she wasn't sure she could. Not yet. As twilight fell, the last of the students left, their laughter fading into the distance. Fiona remained by the hangar door, her hand resting on the cool metal of an old trainer jet, the same model Ethan had once flown. She still kept his badge, the small silver wing marked V1 on a chain around her neck. It had become less of a relic, more of a compass. The wind picked up, teasing her hair. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled a low, familiar growl. She looked up just as the clouds parted, revealing a streak of light across the evening sky. At first she thought it was lightning. Then she realized it was contrail smoke. A single aircraft cut through the sunset, trailing a line of white that shimmered against the orange glow. She squinted, her heart pounding. The plane was small, old, maybe civilian, but the maneuver, the way it rolled and leveled out, it was unmistakable. The voice in her memory came rushing back. "Keep the wing." Her breath caught as the plane dipped low, and then smoke. Not from the engine, but from a carefully timed canister, painting words across the sky in long, steady strokes. Slowly, letters began to form. To Fiona and Katie. "Keep the wing." Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, but the words burned bright against the fading blue. The children who'd lingered outside began to point, shouting in awe. "Look, Miss Fiona, someone's writing your name." She could barely speak. Yes, she whispered, "someone very dear." The plane banked gently, sunlight glinting off its wings. For a heartbeat, it hovered in her line of sight, and though she couldn't see the pilot's face, she didn't need to. She felt it in her bones, in the air, in the rhythm of her pulse. Viper 1 was still flying. The aircraft tilted its wings in salute, then soared upward until it vanished into the glow of dusk. Fiona stood motionless, the wind tugging at her jacket, tears spilling freely. Now tears not of grief, but of grace. Later, when the sky had turned dark and the stars began to pierce through, Fiona walked back inside the hangar. The lights flickered softly above the old jet. Katie, now a little taller, hair still the color of sunrise, was waiting for her by the simulator chair. She held out a small envelope. "The postman left this for you," she said. Fiona opened it. Inside was a photograph, 3 people standing by the sea. Ethan smiling with his arm around Katie, and Fiona herself, from years ago, taken the day of the rescue. On the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, "The sky remembers, but peace lives on the ground. Keep teaching them to fly." EC Fiona pressed the photo to her chest, eyes closing. When she looked up, Katie was watching her with a curious smile. "You miss him, don't you?" Fiona nodded. "Every day. But Daddy says missing someone is just another way of loving them." Fiona's heart swelled. She crouched down, taking the child's hands in hers. "Then we'll keep loving him together." Katie smiled and hugged her tightly. Outside, the night was clear, the kind of sky that seemed vast enough to hold every secret, every promise, every echo of love that refused to fade. As they stood there, the stars shimmered like tiny medals across the heavens. Fiona looked upward and whispered, "Rest easy, Viper 1. The sky still remembers." And for the first time in her life, she felt that it remembered her too. We'd love to know where you're watching, from what corner of the world you call home. Share it in the comments below, because it's always amazing to see how stories of hope and kindness bring hearts together from every place and every walk of life. If this story touched you, inspired you, or simply reminded you that quiet heroes still exist, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel and stay with us for more heartfelt stories like this one. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Your presence means more than you know. And until we meet again, may your days be gentle, your skies clear, and your heart at peace.